Alright guys, thank you so much for coming to Softball Stats. I'm Sean, and I am one of the 12 people who co-run the space. There are a few of us. If you're more interested in stuff about the space, feel free to talk to one of us. But without further ado, I think I want to open the session by saying that this is a private space. We are committed to cultivating a safer and more accountable environment for friends joining us in shared community and activity. We would like to remind everyone to be aware of one another's presence and needs. We do not welcome or tolerate harassment and harmful behavior that reproduces systemic violences through gender, orientation, race, ability, or class. And these are just some of our community agreements that we have for our space. Just a few things before we begin. We've got beers in the fridge at the back, so if you'd like some beers, feel free to help yourself. It's by donation. And also other drinks are available. Non-alcoholic drinks are also available. Your donations help towards our rent, etc. We've also recently have a Patreon account. So feel free if you are so inclined to contribute there. We've also got a wearable archive series that we launched last year to raise some funds to run the space and keep it going. Anything else I need to? Alright. Okay, so without further ado, I'll let Johan introduce the session.
Hi guys. It's like curled in the bit.
Yeah.
Jack.
Okay, hi.
Hi everyone. Thanks for coming down today and thanks for squeezing indoors. The weather just wasn't cooperating with us, so we had to shift it from the rooftop to down here. We also didn't run the risk of getting electrocuted with our new audio equipment. So thank you for all coming down. Thank you to those who are all the way at the back. We hope that the mics are okay. Audio okay? Okay, great.
Louder.
Louder. Oh, good. Louder, good. Good at the back?
Yeah.
Testing? Okay, cool.
Great. I'll raise my voice a little bit. So I'm Johan. I'm one of the artists that's part of Softball Stats, which is this collaborative project that has shared libraries, video exhibitions, little talks such as this, workshops, and other kinds of events as well. I guess I'll introduce Lawrence first. He's an artist, filmmaker, and musician working in the fields of visual reality and simulation. And he's currently London-based, but he's grown up across different cities in Asia, which I think we'll get to in a little bit. He creates site-specific virtual worlds and speculative films using game software, 3D animation, installation, and performance. His background's in architecture at Trinity College, Cambridge, the Architectural Association, London, and the Cooper Union, New York. So these conversations kind of arose. Well, I want to thank Lawrence first and foremost for kind of initiating this. It kind of emerged from a series of conversations we were having for an interview for Vulture magazine. And from there, you kind of found out about Softball Stats, so you were kind of aware.
Yeah, I was actually kind of looking, when I was invited for the biennial, I was looking at different artist-run spaces, basically. And I came across Softball Stats and Horizon 99 because I kind of do that kind of thing in London as well. And I think when you Skyped me, was it from here?
Yeah, it was from here.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the background, and I was like, that looks like an artist-run space.
Yeah,
should do something there.
I think at that point in time, that huge portrait of Solange Knowles was still up there because of Debugger's previous exhibition. So yeah, it looks like a whole mood.
Yeah.
So I also want to thank Anka, who has been the curator working with Lawrence and doing so much to help connect us and coordinate everything as well. So yeah, thank you for making this happen as well. We're really glad to have you here to talk more about 2065 Singapore Centennial Edition. So that's a new commission for Singapore Biennale, and it's based off of an earlier version of your work 2065, which I believe has had multiple iterations. So I think maybe you could I guess the format of this presentation will be this moderated dialogue throughout, and then after that we'll kind of open it up to questions. So we'll be showing some videos, and then we'll have more questions. We'll open it up to a Q&A as well, and we'll finish off with a performance kind of walk through slash musical performance.
Like basically yesterday we were trying to work out whether to do a performance at the beginning or at the end, but we decided to do it at the end so that you know a little bit more what's going on. Like you can kind of pick out details and see how the different parts like fit in together basically. So yeah, and no, I mean thanks for coming. It's nice to do a project based in Singapore. So I mean, should I just introduce?
Yeah, sure. I think it'll be interesting to hear, like, I guess your personal relationship to Singapore.
Yeah, sure. So, me and my sister moved here when we, like, in 1990. So that was actually what the 25th anniversary, and there was like a big spirit of nation building then. So anyway, like, we moved to London like a few years after, but I always thought about the representations of Singapore and also my relationship with it. You know, coming back and having lots of family here. So this project 2065 is kind of came out of a film I made 2 years ago called Geomancer, which is also set in Singapore in 2065. But the way I usually operate is sometimes I might it's kind of like a non-linear process. So I might make a game and then a film and then music and then back into the game and back into another film. So, different parts feed into each other and over time they kind of build on each other like a map. So this iteration of 2065 for the Singapore Biennale this year, it relates both also to the 100th anniversary of the kind of separation from Malaysia, 1965 to 2065, as well as 1819 to 2019, which is the kind of bicentennial edition of this year's biennial. So there are a few things like Geomancer, the film, was meant to be a portrait of the artist as an AI, so this idea of like this coming of age narrative, but instead of it, featuring like a high school kid or something, it's about a super intelligent satellite who kind of comes down to Singapore because they're about to be decommissioned, and also just my observations of how much the ERP road charging system is, the way surveillance networks are operating. Is kind of interesting that it also fits into that narrative, even though it was made 2 years ago. All the kind of, not predictions I would say, all the things I was like kind of feeling of change are pretty consistent with, I think, how I observe things evolving, very much like Singapore wanting to be a smart nation, lots of moves about ecological change, are kind of consistent with that. So even though I wasn't thinking of being like, obviously directly political in that sense, all the observations that I had, for example here, this kind of entryway to Marina Bay Casino where you have, foreigner and local, so locals pay $100 to get in, that would then be subdivided into like foreigner, local, AI and drone that, would be new categories of like citizen or like non-citizen or like immigrant and non-immigrant. So basically all these political ideas in the game are embedded in the set design and kind of different elements like that.
Yeah. So Geomancer kind of is nested within 2065 as well. And whether embedded within it as like films within the museum, for instance, or there are these like voiceover fragments that are kind of told like through the museum kind of narrative as well. Yeah. Do we want to show the videos first?
I think in the tour at the end, they'll be there anyway, yeah. So I could just talk about how they're interwoven. So, what I'm interested in, I guess, like cinematically and visually is basically like any individual's point of view within the world. Because obviously, the first person perspective in video games or like, different camera angles in cinematography are really, essentially they're a way of framing the world very literally. Of course, with a video game, it's like a first-person exploration through that, so I'm interested in just expressing, in a very simple way, the idea of freedom, like simply through movement. For example, this particular shot is, you can jump on top of the drone in certain places, and they can like take you to different locations. So I've kind of left like different Easter eggs. In that one, you can jump on top of the drone and it kind of like takes you on this like aerial view over the landscape. And in the new Asian Civilizations Museum one, there's like this bit where the drone just kind of like hovers for a few seconds above the ground and you can jump onto it and it like takes you up onto the roof of that part, basically. Okay. So I've kind of embedded these yeah, different Easter eggs or different like kind of pathways that interlink different zones within that. So for example, in here where we are, the Art Science Museum, instead of it being like an exhibit, it's exhibiting Geomancer itself.
Yeah.
Because the idea is that when Geomancer is about to get decommissioned on National Day in 2065, in the film Geomancer, they are also being kind of like celebrated as like essentially like, you know, like this war hero kind of thing, you know, this like very proud of their product, basically.
So I think like even the title 2065 has like multiple meanings to it, right? Like whether within the game world itself or like as you mentioned earlier, the time frame as well. So maybe you could talk about like the different kind of versions or like meanings that 2065 means.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, when I was writing the script for Geomancer, I was basically researching, you know, kind of AI and representations of technology in East Asia. So I made this video essay called Sino-Futurism, 1839 to 2046. 1839 referencing the kind of start of First Opium War, and 2046 referencing the Wong Kar-wai film. So this idea that, you know, there's like a kind of this nationalist political agenda within it, but also this kind of essentially emotional basis that's also like nostalgic for the future, which is why I see like Wong Kar-wai's film as kind of signifying in that sense. So in obviously 2046 it's called 2046 because that's the fictional story that the writer is writing in the film, and that's because that's the last year before the end of this
50 year.
Exactly, the 50-year period. Exactly, between 1997 and 2046, when, you know, Hong Kong still has the kind of privileged status of, you know, one nation, two systems kind of thing. So anyway, like, what I was interested in with the Wong Kar-wai film, apart from the narrative and how it's shot and all those kind of things, is this idea of the end is near, basically, right? The end is near not through like environmental apocalypse, but through this kind of like this mood of political change. And so also for me thinking 2065, it's approximately 50 years in the future, right? So where we are now, and Singapore's now, is kind of about the same distance between 1965 and 2065, you know, kind of like halfway in between. I kind of remember when, you know, in 1990 when my family moved back here, well no, kind of moved here, you know, it's like 25 years old, right? So that's kind of like an adolescent country, now kind of like entering middle age, and then like essentially being 100 years old, you know, like this post-colonial condition for a lot of countries who gained independence around the 50s and 60s, especially from the UK. But this idea in Geomancer, so you had this kind of like trajectory of the nation that went from, you know, like newly independent to actually being very authoritarian, right, and extremely conservative, and maybe more so. And this kind of AI also being like, you know, basically the search for independence of the nation versus search for independence of the individual, and those are the two parallel things. But of course, in a film, it operates differently because, you know, there's a main character and dialogue and stuff than an open world game. So that's a kind of difference of medium.
And maybe we could just like set up also like the different worlds that, or like the different versions of 2065 as well, that kind of, because it's kind of gained different locations as it's gone along and as the different versions have gone along, it's built up. So this is maybe the 4th or 5th version already. Yeah. So it started with K11 in Hong Kong, and you've recreated that space, and it's under the portal called Gallery. And that's kind of like the formal introduction to 2065. Maybe we could talk like spatially as like the player experiences the video game, if they were to go into these places sequentially, how they kind of like encounter it as well.
Yeah, so basically whenever I'm making a game or like set design, I'm also thinking not just spatially, but cinematographically, whatever. You know, essentially how the camera is going to journey through the space. So with 2065, I kind of thought like, you know, I mean, of course, this is in front of Marina Bay Shopping Centre and one of the kind of like kind of atriums that there is. I think in this one, in reality, there's this kind of weird like dome fountain. You know, it's like a hole with it's like a funnel basically with water that goes down to the basement. So basically I thought that that's a good point to put the teleporter, which is this pavilion with these kind of 5 gallery, casino, and so on teleporters. And that facade would be the entrance to K11 in Hong Kong. So basically K11 is this series of main Hong Kong and China shopping malls, basically where the concept is art and shopping, basically. So they're aimed at millennials, and in each of the malls they try and integrate like art in a very general sense. So everything from like kids workshops to kind of like design fairs and, you know, like draw your favorite anime character to like exhibitions like this one. And so I wanted to kind of import that into the world here, essentially. So, I mean, there's a few different things going on there. Like, one of them is this idea of, you know, essentially the virtual world being a collage of different places and different times. That's one thing. The other is the idea that the artwork also is like an archive of the places where it's been exhibited. So now it's, you know, got K11, Barbican, and Asian Civilizations Museum. So the idea is also that over time, the game accumulates the locations where it's been, because in my experience as well, one of the problems with doing site-specific installations, especially new media things, is that they're very ephemeral and temporary. So I wanted to try and think of a way to essentially resist that easy deletion of memory when it comes to like an exhibition, especially in a white cube setting, or even in a biennial setting where, you know, every 2 years the renewal is complete, you know, and amnesia sets in really quickly. So the idea that the game would act as a form of memory as opposed to a form of entertainment was kind of important, but of course it is, I mean, it's not fun, but it's kind of like anti-fun, which is kind of fun in a way, I don't know. Yeah. And also the other thing that, as well, it's this idea of not just so the virtual world can contain many different places and many different times, but also it operates in a different level of, how should I say, I was trying to like think, maybe subconsciously think of this, it's not even decolonial narrative, it's kind of like colonization in reverse in a sense, because the virtual world can contain more space, let's say, than the physical world. So, you know, for example, the Asian Civilizations Museum room is like 15 meters by 6, but of course the world within the game is much larger than that. Yeah. And so, in a way, usually the way artworks operate, you know, you take part, I mean physical artworks, you take part in an exhibition across the globe, you send some art, you send some physical artworks, it gets installed there, and then they get sent back to you. But it's essentially import-export, right? It's import-export without a trace being left at the end or any kind of like transactional thing. You're kind of paid for your labor in participating, but there's nothing kind of further than that.
So do you see like the virtual space as a kind of spanner in the works for this kind of import-export system, or do you see it as also an extension of that?
I'm not entirely sure, because I mean it doesn't really operate in the same sense.
Yeah.
Of course it occupies more space, except it's like 5 gigabytes instead of, you know, a certain amount of like, which is actually a different kind of pain, because, you know, here I am, lousy hotel Wi-Fi, and it's just like takes all night. So it's a different kind of labor involved. But what I'm just trying to say is the idea that instead of my work being contained in the space, then it's this idea of the space being contained in the work. So it's not being like an anti-narrative, but it's just a way to kind of make that relationship a bit more non-linear, playful, basically.
Yeah. So I was curious about, because you mentioned also about the idea of fun or like not fun, and how do you think about like your games, like in relation, and I guess your approach to constructing these video game worlds, because I know you come from a background of architecture and of space, so maybe how that affects the way you view the video game as a kind of medium that you're working with and also on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I always feel it's possible to over-intellectualize the nature of the medium that you're working in. But of course, for example, with video games, you can talk about, simulation theory, you can talk about like architectural theory, you can talk about like, kind of play theory and every other sort of like, or, digital new media and anthropology and so on. But for me, it's just more direct in the sense of like, these are kind of the idea of exploration may or may not be playful in itself. Because sometimes the idea of exploration has a kind of like, the impulse of power, right? The desire to like see things and gain ownership of like distant locations and so on. Basically the kind of like colonial narrative. There's also the kind of cinematic narrative where if you look at, for example, disciplines like, in-game photography or people using GTA to shoot, machinima or shoot their own stills or so on, there's this idea of image making using the nature of the medium itself.
Yeah.
And of course, from an architectural point of view, architecture, a kind of medium which is really anti-fun. And I don't mean that in the sense that it can't be playful, but I think for me, architecture always operates in a mode of composition, right? So you're always like drawing a space before it actually exists, but there's no such thing as, what's that? There's this kind of cliched quote that, like, writing about music is dancing about architecture, right? Because, like, intellectual writing versus music and, dance performance versus architecture are such different ways of engaging with an idea. So for me, like, I'm very conscious of the set design, like deliberately choosing, Art Science Museum and Marina Bay Sands Towers. But those set design things are more like thinking about the symbolic language of what those places are. So of course, they just represent this idea of gambling and gaming and neoliberal entertainment.
Yeah.
So it's like the equivalent of their visual language.
Yeah.
But in terms of like actual like fun, I'm quite into like making things, like I don't know, like stripping things away basically.
Like a video game without objective is something that I hear you talk about frequently, like self-deprecatingly you talk about 2065 about how it doesn't have a goal or like it doesn't have like these common achievements or necessary quests that you have to go on for a video game, but it's more of like this kind of walking simulation. But I think that the fun that is to be had really is in the imagery that's being used and sometimes the over-the-top nature of how these very glossy textures or models or imaginings of these nations are. So I'm very curious about, tying it back to like kind of the things that we proposed, like whether it was the smart city or the Disneyland with the death penalty, like what are the kinds of imaginings that you're working from, I think?
Yeah, so I mean, when Johan and I were talking about what readings to make, we were talking before about the William Gibson essay, Disneyland with the Death Penalty, which then I was reminded was written in April 1993 for one of the first issues of Wired, which was actually a time just before we left for London, basically. So I knew exactly what word images William Gibson was writing about, but of course the interpretation was slightly different, and of course in that one that's kind of problematic in that it's very much a kind of product of its time. So when I read this or I read the Rem Koolhaas essay about the kind of Singapore tabula rasa kind of thing, it's like it's very strange because I can't like disagree with it because I agree with it, but it just seems. But then I wonder, is that because it's my judgment is just as colored by that as from my own personal experience? And so for 2065, it's really trying to, use personal experiences as much as possible and just like my observations and research into, how things are evolving. But, with the Rem Koolhaas and for the William Gibson piece, it's we were saying that the best way I can describe them is they're products of their time.
Yeah, it's
right?
like artifacts almost.
Artifacts.
And like the way it was interesting to me and how it links up to kind of the discourses that you're interested in of the smart city and things like that, like in the Art Halpern text. It doesn't talk about Singapore specifically apart from a few mentions, but also the idea of the smart city as an experimental prototype city of tomorrow, which is Epcot, which is something that Walt Disney himself coined, and it's the name of one of the Disney theme parks as well. So even how like these genealogies or like etymologies of these like smart cities also kind of weave its way back into that theme park kind of notion. Yeah. So
I mean, the closest way I could even describe it is that the fact that, like, you know, if you read a movie review, you can't help but see the movie through that lens, you know? And so it's just so strange to me how strongly judgment can be manipulated, basically, through the reading these, especially reading through these like kind of essentially like essays of like cultural criticism. You know, it's a very kind of strange kind of soft power that they wield. And so for me, trying to, I mean, like either be really overt, like this ad for Farsight, which is, you know, this fictional and now real kind of company that's made Geomancer and these different games. Like I'm trying to play with different modes of language in that sense, like either the real like kind of advertising, you know, promising the utopian future, or this really kind of like, you know, poetic narrative that the 2065 trailer has, but it's a very different mode of communication.
Yeah, and I think not just these different types of, whether it's the language of this very commercial capitalist type of logic, but also ideas of nationalism and how that's utilized all kind of goes hand in hand sometimes with those logics as well. Like how you use, like, for instance, the Union Jack flag that's like plastered all over the Barbican, or like the installation itself at ACM, how when you arrive, the 4 kind of gaming stations are positioned on top of a map that's in the shape of the map of Singapore. So it's like these very overt, very obvious, almost blatant performances of national symbols. And I was curious about like the use of that within your games or within your installations.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It seems, firstly, it's like a really obvious way to cite the place, or to cite the game. Like it's a Union Jack, so it's probably got something to do with the UK. But I also remembered just how strange it was in terms of how nationalism was performed when I came here as like a primary 2 student. You know, the national songs, the national anthem, the raising of the flag, the lowering of the flag. It's pretty intense. It's pretty intense, and I just wasn't cynical about it then, because, you know, it's just like a kind of collective ritual that also signals the beginning of the school day and the end of the school day. But for me, just talking about the medium itself, because virtual world is incredibly abstract, right? Actually, you know, I could say this is K11, or I could say that's the Marina Bay Casino, but actually most people wouldn't know that unless like they actually have to put a sign there, and, you know, putting like a national colors or national flag or, you know, a bit of text is really one of the really important, like, basically navigational landmarks in these worlds. So for example, Frederick Jameson, who's a kind of postmodern cultural theorist, like wrote about a particular hotel in Los Angeles called the Bonaventure Hotel, and basically the Bonaventure Hotel was designed to be this like hermetically sealed like 5-cylinder kind of hotel, but, you know, with like lots of levels, lots of intersecting walkways, and it was kind of symmetrical, like, so it was kind of like a 4-leaf clover with the main kind of tower in the middle. But the problem, of course, is that everyone just got lost all the time, right? And so the kind of classic architect thing is like they would believe that, you know, three-dimensional form speaks for itself, but actually it doesn't. It's just, you know, without signs, everyone would just be lost. So in the same way, like I am always trying to think just in terms of set design, what is the minimum or necessary number of like signs? Sometimes it's literally a sign saying casino, right? Within the world to integrate like essentially verbal language into the spatial language, like casino, teleport. Like sometimes it has to be incredibly literal, and that's it depends how open I want to be. Because of course, I could say navigationally it's an open world, but of course the set design is very particular. Kind of like how, you know, cityscapes, especially smart cities, it's all the manipulations is designed to be invisible. like we were talking about yesterday, the disappearance of the ERP electronic, gantries to a kind of aerial surveillance or radar-based system towards like this culture of visible control to invisible control.
I'm curious if whether that kind of set design or like whether that carries through into the physical installation as well. Because there is kind of a way that you want your players to be experiencing the game. For instance, when you enter for like the current iteration of 2065, it's like 4 like PlayStations, and like was there any particular way those were meant to be like conceived of in relation to the space as well?
Yeah, I mean, for example, I remember that in old kind of like arcade, video games arcades, basically you'd have these like, was it like Daytona USA, like driving games, and you'd have like 4 seats together, and you race around the track together. But I kind of wanted to play with this idea because it's not a multiplayer experience. It's all, it's all disconnected solo games.
Yeah.
But everyone's kind of like lost in the world together at the same time, if that makes sense. And also spatially, when I see people play the games, it's interesting because they navigate it and they explore it and they kind of get lost, just like they're exploring like a real physical space. So the installation is always is equally about like 2 people playing in the chair and someone else watching people playing in the chair, right? So sometimes if they're friends or partners or whatever, they'll be like, oh, you've really been here, you should like turn left. Like you always get lost. You never ask for directions.
I wanted to play the game like the day of the opening, like yesterday, and it was like at ACM, so it's like the same public area where they hold like kids workshops and stuff like that, so they were like lining up to play, and when I sat down to try and play the game before, they were like, why is it taking so long? And so it's like I had to like step aside and let them play. So it's very much also like you as a player within the installation navigating the game as well, and these kinds of like worlds within worlds that are embedded within your works, because this technique of like the mise en beams, like the worlds within the worlds, when you first enter the game, the first thing you see is literally the exhibition space you're in. And this is kind of something that you've like used with for example in Farsight Stock Exchange, because I think that was in London at Bold Tendencies, and like the point of coming to the exact space within the game that replicates the exact area that you're sitting in and playing the game, like that was a moment of realization for me that I was exploring this space that has been like completely reconfigured for the future. So these kinds of experiences, I was wondering like the use of mise en beams, like how does that work for you, whether it's like just remediating the exact same space that the person is in, or like referencing your previous works as well?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the simplest mise en beam is 2 mirrors facing each other, basically, right? And kind of like going off into infinity. I think it's interesting that you're mentioning that, because I guess it operates on a few different levels. On the simplest one is essentially like a replication and alteration of the physical environment within the virtual one. So a replication of the gallery space that you then walk through, and then you play the game, and then you're walking through again. So I'm interested in this very uncanny, like, deja vu kind of lost highway kind of vibe, basically, of like, oh, like I've been through here, but not at this pace, not with this atmosphere, not with, and this deja vu as much as mise en beam. So I think mise en beam can be used as this kind of like, MC Escher like visual effect, or this hall of mirrors. But I'm much more interested in how it operates in terms of your memory. So for example, you were saying like you're playing a game, you're alone in the game, but you're surrounded by kids, right? But it's a strange thing because it's not a virtual reality 360 video, but you're kind of surrounded, because in the installation there's kind of like this triple monitor setup, and then you're kind of like in these like cockpit racing chairs, and then if there's like kids on either side of you, it's kind of like, it could be quite claustrophobic, but it just depends on what kind of player you are, I guess. But the other kind of mise en beam is, it's not going off into infinity, it's more this like sequence of worlds, right? So there's Geomancer, and then there's a 2065 game, there's a video essay called Sinofuturism, then there's another film called Idol, and there's another video called PlayStation and VR Project, but they're all kind of logically consistent in terms of how the narrative plays out chronologically. So like I said, when we were chatting yesterday, so logically in Geomancer happens in 2065, but 20 years before that, Farsight made the AI, and then 7 years before that, they moved from London to Singapore, and then 18 years before that, they were established. So, you know, like, the chronology is actually consistent in the same way as, you know, you read this, whatever, science fiction or fantasy novel, and or history book, and there's, like, the chronology at the beginning.
Yeah.
So for me, the way to, like, tie things down and not get lost in a mise-en-abîme in terms of, like, a fictional world building or writing sense is to just have this, you know, work things out chronologically, but then how they're represented cinematically or in a game doesn't have to be that linear.
Yeah. So it's kind of like you were mentioning yesterday, like why didn't you make 2065 as a film? And yeah, maybe you want to respond to that. Like why instead of like for Geomancer it was a CGI film, so why the choice of the video game specifically as well?
Yeah, so yeah, Johanna was just asking yesterday why I didn't make 2065 a film. So for me, like, it's best, because, you know, for me, in general, I don't really make abstract work. Like, my work is incredibly literal. Like, if I want to say something is a casino, I model a casino, I write the fact that it's a casino, it looks like a casino, and there's gambling tables. So, for me, if I'm making a film, it would not be a kind of like, you know, some artists might make a film that's playing with film form or questioning what duration is and this kind of thing. But actually for me, I just want to make like a story that is interesting to watch. Because for me personally, I just have a low attention span. So that's really important for me. So basically my films, they have to be able to like be one-liners. Like Geomancer is like, AI wants to be an artist in Singapore, that's it. Or like Idol, the sequel, is like, you know, a singer wants to make a comeback and enlist the help of an AI. So it's kind of like a one-liner thing.
Yeah.
Of course, it's more complicated than that because of all the backstory and all that kind of stuff. But for 2065, it's not about one journey or pathway. It could be the setting for, like, let's say, you know, a corrupt group of eSports players like tries to win something, you know, this kind of thing. But as a game, as an exploration, like it doesn't operate like that, and I would need a whole nother level of like production to actually turn it into like a narrative or this thing with like a beginning and an end, basically. So I just feel that it's just more creatively interesting for me to keep it open. You know, it's like it can keep on expanding. I don't feel I have to fit everything in. Because the other thing is when you're working on a film, especially a CGI film, you're probably not going to build stuff that you're not going to see. I mean, that's how set design operates in cinema and in soap operas, right? They build 2.5 walls and a bit of a floor because that's all they're going to see in the frame. And of course, with an open world game or a virtual reality thing, it's kind of the world's in 360.
Yeah. I think there's also like the video portion that plays at the back of the installation as well. Do you want to show that as well, or like?
I mean, it's basically this trailer that's been playing here, and so basically the video is playing on the back of this kind of box that these that gaming chairs are at. And what's important for me is that actually it's more about sound. So the sound is the music and voiceover come from the TV screen on the back, which the people can hear when they're playing but not be distracted from visually. And it's only when they go around the back that they see this kind of like big render of like the Merlion on Marina Bay with that video trailer on there, basically on the other side of the island. And once they go around that, so for me as well, like it's not important whether people see the video or play the game first or play the game and then see the video, because sometimes the video gives hints about what places you can go to in the game, kind of like you have, you know, walkthroughs on like Twitch or YouTube where people explore the game and, you know, go through everything. So it's just another entry point into it.
Would you say that it's the world building that is the most important aspect of your work? Because it feels like the video, the installation, and the game are all like constituent elements of this entity that is 2065, which is neither specifically a space or a time, but it kind of blends those things together, quite similar to how like 2046 Morikawa is kind of imagined as well. So is it like this world building and the game, the film, the installation, all of it kind of?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I don't know what's most important because I'm probably like the worst judge of that. Because you know, as like an artist or anyone who makes stuff, sometimes I forget what kind of bias this is, but you know, the more time you put into something, the more invested you are into thinking that that's the most important thing about it, but it might not actually be. So actually, for me, the most complicated thing between the laborious like set design and so on is actually like writing, and that's the writing and the music basically, because those are the two things that I think create emotional engagement or operate in memory. And what I like with, like, for example, Wong Kar-wai films is that how they don't contradict each other, but they don't intersect perfectly like a soap opera does, right? It's not like there's a cliffhanger and then there's the next one. Sometimes the links between them happen organically or narratively or through characters who aren't named, but you're thinking that like it's the same character at different stages of their life, right? But it's never that explicit. And so because it's like consistent but not, you know, it's consistent but not explicit, it lives in your head in a different way. Like I always feel that what's interesting about just the way that you read a novel, for example, is the fact that it lives in your head for longer than you're actually reading it, you know? So you read a bit, you stop, you read a bit, you stop. But in between, you know, your mind is operating in it and the world is kind of alive in a sense, you know? So that's a world building thing, not necessarily this like science fiction idea of world building where like, you know, everything's logical and like the science is perfect and so on, but just the way that the work lives in your head in a different way. Yeah. That's more interesting to me. Yeah.
I'm gonna be opening up to like questions soon, but maybe I have like one last question, like picking off the idea of consistency and how malleable these different worlds or works are. Because one of the things I'm thinking about is like how Sino-futurism is kind of reconfigured almost in the situation of 2065. Maybe we could talk a bit, like contextualize a bit about Sino-futurism first for those who are familiar with it.
So basically Sino-futurism is just a video essay that's more like a kind of, it's not a manifesto because for various reasons. Anyway, it's like a conspiracy theory that essentially like Chinese technological development is the mirror image of AI in the sense that it's this kind of non-human, non-emotional force that seeks to replicate itself. So basically in Geomancer, when I was researching it, I was observing that portrayals of AI and kind of Chinese industrialization were exactly the same, both in its positive and negative aspects. So for example, you watch Fox News, and I literally got all the source footage by Googling like Chinese AI, and it would be one of two things. It would either be like, it's the best thing in the world, or it's the worst thing in the world, right? And so not just Chinese AI, but you know, like Chinese industrialization, you know, whether it's kind of Alex Jones on InfoWars and kind of Fox News being against it, or these, you know, documentaries and these kind of like pro-China business documentaries that, you know, China will save the future because it's the only economy large enough to do that and so on. So I kind of thought about this further and I realized that all of the ways that, and not just in its portrayals, but even in the kind of nuts and bolts of it, like the way that deep learning, you know, this kind of current breakthrough technology in AI is proceeding. It's like capable of like learning massive amounts of information, working 24/7, really good at copying, really good at computing, you know, really good at labor for no pay, really prone to addiction, different sorts of problems. Like exactly the same things were talked about with, you know, essentially the Chinese culture and deep learning, you know, can work 24/7, really good at studying and so on. So anyway, the video essay is a kind of expansion on this basic framework that it's not like a kind of ethno-nationalist perspective, it's actually looking at the commonalities between two forms of, let's say, post-human intelligence that are treated in a very dehumanized fashion. AI is dehumanized because it's not human, and let's say a kind of Chinese massive labor is dehumanized because it's conceived as a massive labor force as opposed to like a group of individuals. So anyway, that's what the politics of Sino-futurism is. In the work, it's different.
It's something else, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So, in the work, because it's set in 2065, I've also considered that in 2065, all the AIs would have watched everything that's on YouTube and Vimeo and whatever streaming service there is in the future, including, of course, Geomancer and Sino-futurism. And so in the game, the AIs who have made the game have watched Sino-futurism and thought that, oh, that would be a nice basis for our art movement, basically. So in this sense, that Sino-futurism is not, it's a conspiracy today, but it would be used as a manifesto in the future. So kind of like a time capsule, basically, addressed for this kind of future people with this kind of future consciousness. That's how it operates in the game.
I just really like that kind of, the way you continually include like previous works, but that was like rejigged in some way to fit, or like reconfigured to kind of fit this world that you're constructing as well. That's always growing. Yeah. So I guess I kind of want to start opening it up to questions. So like if you have any questions, just feel free to like raise your hand and probably like shout it out. If anyone has any questions regarding maybe 2065, or if you'd like to hear a bit more about maybe his previous work.
Don't be shy.
Yeah. If not, I still have questions, I guess. Are there any questions from the audience? I guess I'll continue with my questions. Yeah, I think yesterday there was a conversation we were having about smart cities and dumbness, or like the embedded dumbness that is within like AMA or smart cities itself, and that's kind of taken from like what happened and how she talks about like smart cities as well. So like maybe is that something that you're exploring in your work as well?
Yeah, no, I mean definitely, like for example, like I'm just going to play this video. I've been looking at not just smart cities but smart buildings in a sense, or like there's this idea that like before this, the Ore Halpern essay about testbed urbanism looks at smart cities in this city of Songdo in Korea, in South Korea, as a location where everything is being this kind of like this factory test site to test like smart city innovation, surveillance, transport network, environmental features like water and different services. In this project, which is an hotel, which is a kind of collaborative project I did with my friend, musician Code9, who's also a writer, Steve Goodman. In this, we're looking at like not a smart city, but like a smart building, basically. And so the Notel, basically the premise, the one-liner, is that it's a fully automated luxury hotel, basically. So this idea of luxury and this kind of like Hilton meets, I don't know, Google, basically. So firstly, this idea that, how should I say, some people's idea of luxury, there's this kind of like, how should I say, like 19th century version of luxury where everyone has like, you have butlers, you have waiters, you have people like serving you all your every need, and you've got like loads of servants and maids and this kind of thing. But there's a different kind of luxury where actually you're just not disturbed, right? So it's really interesting that even if you look at the modern hospitality industry, like, as a hotel, for example, it's like this kind of perfect system where in some cases there's no interaction between the servants, essentially, room service, people cleaning your room, and the guests, right? So not only do they have physically different locations where they move throughout the building, right? They also have like different temporal functions. So, for example, people generally clean the rooms when hotel guests will be absent. So there's like two perfectly non-intersecting time and space don't intersect in the system. Anyway, Notel is kind of about this idea of luxury that essentially involves no human contact. And in the Notel, because everything is under constant monitoring, you don't even like imagine you don't even have to ask for room service because you look, based on your motion for the last 30 minutes, you look like you're hungry and you need a burger, right? So, for example, you don't need to unlock, or most simply, you don't need to unlock anything because the security is automated. You don't even have to, basically all your needs are anticipated in this sense. So anyway, the Notel is, this is just the video walkthrough of it. It's like 600 meters across, but it only has room, it's for like 12 guests, basically. And at this scale where everyone has, God knows how many square feet together, each of the rooms, it's not just a luxury suite, it's literally like a whole modern, like classic modernist house, essentially, that forms each individual suite. And that's kind of like a section through it, basically. So you have like this big atrium that goes in a ring around it, and you have here like these corridor security features on both sides, because of course if you're a high net worth individual rich enough to stay at the Notel, you're also probably going to be slightly paranoid, and so there's all digital encryption services and all high-tech security. And similarly, like with 2065, this was located in different places. So this was in London. It was like reflecting on this idea of like luxury real estate. In The Hague, in the Netherlands, which tries to the city tries to brand itself as this international center for justice and peace, but actually there's as active like a kind of surveillance and digital defense and cybersecurity industry that's there. So in every different, and in Art Basel earlier this year, I kind of added this like private bunker collector's gallery vault where you can keep your like priceless Picassos and Da Vincis and stuff. So in a similar way to what I was saying with 2065, every location talks about a different idea of physical security and how that's manifest in the place. But this was an ongoing project since 2016, and so again, like 2065, it's gone through like different iterations of itself. But this was the first case where it's this idea that there's an interior of a building that encapsulates many different ideas. So for example, these posters on the walls right here are Executive Master's Program in Cybersecurity, which was leaflets given out when I did a site visit to one of these places in The Hague. This idea that with this kind of simulation, sometimes people are like, oh wow, what a great idea. And I'm like, no, it's not going to happen. They're like, no, but why not? So it's this idea where you're kind of anticipating the logic of reality or like the demands of it, but some people don't get that it's a joke. And then
what about like these very hyperbolic extrapolations of what the future might be like, I think, and the kind of playfulness that's kind of realized in a very like silly or like irreverent kind of manner as well. I'm very curious about, you mentioned it was a collaboration and like maybe the role of music in relation to this. I understand you have a background in like electronic music as well.
Yeah, so I mean it's quite nice because lately I've been able to do more of my own soundtracks basically, but I used to do just a lot of music stuff. And like what I love about it, for example, is I was saying before, like if architecture is a mode of like pure composition, basically, music, at least in some circumstances, is a mode of like pure performance, right? I mean, if you're kind of playing an instrument and not just pressing like spacebar like I will do in half an hour's time to play some tracks and so on. Like I really enjoy just the different mode of like what world building essentially with sound rather than through space. This particular project, so my friend Steve, he's a musician, and he had made an album essentially about nothingness and the void, not just kind of conceptually and spatially, but also kind of emotionally, because his best friend had just kind of passed away as well. So it's not just about the spaces of like neoliberal capitalism, but this idea of where, like I was saying before, like where does memory go, especially in a location like a hotel, right? So in terms of big data, like it literally remembers you because you don't need your Hilton rewards card because they're like, welcome back, Johan. Do you still want the same sweet and like cucumber sandwich as you had last time? So this idea that smart building has a memory of you in a very real sense, as well as you have memories of your previous stay at the smart building. Because personally, for me, I quite enjoy staying in hotels because, you know, like I get hot breakfast and like, you know, it's like nice fluffy towels and stuff. Whereas some people really hate the fact that it's like a non-domesticated space. For me, because, you know, I spent a lot of childhood moving around, like it's actually quite a familiar location. And whereas people might associate hotels or like this kind of location with the kind of, you know, the shiny kind of horror kind of thing. For me, it's uncannily, feels more, sometimes I feel more at home there than I feel at home, basically, because it's this international non-place. Oh, here, for example, is one of the suites, which is the Mies van der Rohe Barcelona Pavilion, basically, except it's your bathroom, which is very nice, and floating bed. Yeah.
I'm interested in like most of these spaces that you recreate. It sounds like there's always kind of a personal entry point to all of these spaces, as well as a lot of your projects. Like whether with 2065 as well, like the construction of these different worlds, is it very much tied to a kind of subjective experience of these places, or like is there also kind of an additional research that goes to it?
Yeah, I mean, I basically try to only create places that I have a personal connection to. So for example, low attention span. So if I'm not interested in a place or in a, like modeling a thing, and you can imagine takes time, and so if I get bored with the process or the reason for it being there, or like forget about why it's necessary to make a spinning bed in, you know, this like shiny green bathroom, then I'll probably wouldn't be doing it. But in a way, like it's a way for me. It's not just a personal thing, like personal connection with Singapore, personal connection to music and so on. But it's a practice basically. So my practice involves observing places, trying to alter them, and in some cases replicate them, and try to bring that together with some kind of like political agenda and emotional like worldview to do with like fiction and kind of creating these experiences which are as much like cinematic and kind of video game as they are like, you know, about like literature and music basically. But yeah, so it's always very personal, and sometimes when it's not personal, I just have to be quite like practical about things in a sense. Like, so there's a practice of, you know, obviously with these compared to my earlier work, I've just got better at doing the process and becoming more familiar with, for example, the limitations of an open world game, or how necessary it is to work through a consistent narrative when I'm writing a film, and being really particular about just the verbal language with that.
Yeah, thanks for that. I just wanted to check if anyone else happens to have any more questions.
Maybe it would be interesting to explain about the Farsight and how it became a real deal.
The question was about the Farsight Corporation.
Yeah. So, okay, so this is quite a good example. So on a practical note, like Farsight was the fictional company that made Geomancer, and they're kind of like the corporate nemesis, you know, like the like Skynet or whatever. No, sorry, Cyberdyne Systems, who make Skynet and Terminator. You know, the kind of like corporate nemesis, which is a very common trope in science fiction. However, I'm also interested in like looking at, you know, the other side. So obviously, as like an artist, most people would be, you know, completely against the corporation. But for me, having the reason for my existence is my parents work for Singapore Airlines, like a state-owned, heavily polluting, like transnational corporation. So I think for me personally, it would be slightly, I don't know, hypocritical, or like, you know, like, not even hypocritical, self-hating actually, to be like, oh, corporations are bad, because actually they're the reason I physically exist. So anyway,
yeah, there's a complicity in there.
Yeah, no, exactly. So anyway, for this, for Farsight, I kind of thought that an alternate version of myself, like if I stayed in Singapore, you know, like did really well at school, which probably wouldn't have done, but if I had, and like everything had gone well, and I became, what is it, like a presidential scholar, went to Harvard Business School, like came back, like, do you know what I mean? Got lots of like venture capital funding, especially now. Started a very successful AI and smart city company called Farsight, and then like that could be me.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it absolutely wouldn't, but it's possible because that's what some people do that, right? Which is great because it's necessary in some sense. So anyway, so Farsight, I started as my my studio production company basically, like last year. So I thought actually instead of just operating with it as this, kind of in-joke, basically my work, I could like take it seriously so that when I'm writing my future films, I obviously have to integrate like corporate motivations against individual interests and the needs of the state versus, like a person's search for freedom. I actually know what it is to run a company, which is like a massive pain, basically. But like I can empathize with the different characters that I have to write. And so on a personal basis, that kind of makes sense. And also, even just on a practical basis, like now I work with friends and we work together on different aspects of the film. I have to work as part of a team, and I'm no longer just an individual making these works like by myself in my studio. So there's just a different, awareness of different mechanisms that the world operates in, not just space, but also like different organizations, different cultures to do with like commerce and import and export and these kind of things that I feel for me, just might add a greater sense of depth to the work as well, especially because so much of it is about the world as it has been created by technology, which is also the world as it has been created by corporations, essentially.
Yeah, thanks for that. Maybe if we have like any last questions from the audience. If not, we have one.
Thanks for sharing. Earlier today I was at the Art Science Museum and they have a new exhibition also on the future. So it's interesting to look at different visions of what the future could be. And yours is one that's very shaped by technology and artificial intelligence, right? And I was wondering, given like the recent events like backlash against tech companies, people wanting more privacy, like how do you think this will play out? Or if you were to do like the next work on it, and in this team, like would you do anything differently, or what would you like to explore more?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think the Art Science Museum exhibition is called 2219, right? So it's in 200 years' time. And it's quite interesting because, like, as they say, for different reasons, like technology is accelerating, right? So for example, they have Moore's law, which, suggests that, computing power doubles, computing power doubles every 4 years, or, one of these kind of like exponentially growing technological progressions. I mean, one thing that basically my next film, rather than being set like in too distant a future, is actually set in the like more near future, basically. And it looks at essentially a crime involving a self-driving car. So presently, this has happened with an Uber case in Arizona, basically. An Uber car operating in fully automatic mode, like hit and killed a woman who's crossing the street. It's problematic as well because, of course, as Uber tries to cover their back in every single way. So of course they have a human chaperone who's meant to step on the brake. The human chaperone was, watching stuff on Hulu, watching her tablet basically. And so there's it's kind of like it's not a comedy because someone died, but it's just this comedy of errors basically that create these situations. So basically my next film is looking more about I don't mean real life scenarios, but more the near future as opposed to the very distant future. Because to me 200 years is so far in the future that anything goes, basically. And so for me, if you want to speculate about colonizing Mars, or like going to Alpha Centauri, or like whatever, or the eradication of poverty or gender or any of these issues, like, yeah, that's totally doable, because 200 years is so far away, and even like 50 years is very close. But I mean, it might not even be in my lifetime, but it's kind of close enough that I have a responsibility to actually like research what is going to happen at that point. But with the 200 year, I mean, I don't know how the works are framed in this sense, but it is too far away for me to try to remain consistent with my narrative, because essentially there's no boundaries with that.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you could comment on your relationship with the Sino-futurism kind of aesthetic, because I feel like the work it's obliquely related to the kind of what we associate with, the term Sino, but it's not really about, like China or something. Like, I'm just just wondering what your relationship with it is. Do you have?
Can you be more specific?
Do you have a personal relationship with China, for instance?
I guess.
You do.
What do you mean by that?
Because I feel like for work to be linked to something so specific, Sino-futurism, it's almost kind of, I think maybe it might be my own bias. Like I could very easily sort of go down that route of thinking that like it is like the work is specifically about like something to do with China, or like.
I mean, it is
Do you think
also
so?
about China.
Do you think so? Okay.
I think so.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
I mean, okay. So, for example, there's one. How should I say? Just in terms of like, in terms of language, right?
Yeah.
So there's this notion that when you say China, you're not just talking about the country, but you're talking about the civilization, you're talking about
You
the
think
nation
that?
state, you're talking about. Sorry?
No, I'm just clarifying. It's that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're talking about the civilization, the nation state, the language, the culture, the history, and
Yes.
so on. So part of it is, on an oblique way,
Yeah.
essentially, and I say this in the beginning of the video essay itself, it's not so my notion of China is the fact that it's not located in China. So for example, the aspects of like China's relationship with technology, because it's not localized to a geographical location,
it's not.
it's spread out throughout everywhere because it's distributed in the way it's manufactured.
Absolutely.
Everyone's kind of like complicit with that. It also operates in the mode of like, let's say, Chinese diaspora. So for example, what's interesting is that different, and this is more talking about like the kind of colonial or decolonial narrative, right? Is that very often the idea of a kind of being outside of a place geographically gives a different awareness of it. So for example, just very simply, the fact that very different, let's say, mainland Chinese traditions are preserved in Southeast Asia or Hong Kong or Taiwan that are absent from the mainland because of historical reasons, right? So there's this kind of, it's not, how should I say, it's kind of asymmetric, basically, that the way I'm talking about China obviously very much as grounded in the country itself, but as a kind of global condition. Because when I was watching all of the documentaries, when they said China, they meant the nation state, they meant the Chinese people, they meant people there, they meant the factories there, and the kind of politics going on there. But my conspiracy theory essentially is that it's not contained to that single place or time or even ethnicity, basically. Yeah.
So is there a way you draw a limit to the way in which the word Sino, because it obviously comes from an anthropological perspective and tradition, and especially I think in like philosophy as well, right? The whole concept of the Sino kind of sinology, for instance, is this kind of implication of the wider influence that so-called, this civilization, quote unquote, that we created in our heads, that kind of like opposes the Western civilization, that kind of stuff, is formed. So I'm curious, how do you draw the limit to that? I mean, because the influence of China is quite kind of, it's it's kind of weird, and it goes all the way to almost. I mean, it's possible to pick up almost anything and be like, there's a bit of China in that. I don't think that would be too overt or crazy.
I mean, again, I'm not like an anthropologist, so actually, even just in terms of the title, it's kind of polemic in the sense that like they're two words that are slightly contradicting each other,
That's
right?
right.
So you have Sino, which is a very kind of like retro word, basically,
That's
right?
Yeah.
A retro word rooted in a kind of study of the other, and you have futurism, which is meant to be, I mean, future looking. So again, you have, but again, in the years, it's the kind of 1839 thing, this, not just like this idea of, you know, this catastrophe that brought about, like, let's say, like, national shame, probably more, but also 2046, this idea of, like, this kind of future problem.
Yeah.
So it's this kind of, like, just linguistically, it was really, you're completely right about creating this contrast between, like, something that might be seen as, like, retro and regressive, like fundamentalism, as well as being kind of, like, progressive and kind of utopian, like futurism. And it's really, I don't draw a boundary because I'm really ambivalent about the kind of the pros and cons of both of those things.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting that you allow the contradiction of these two words to kind of battle each other and let this two word play its own kind of game and set the limits for your own work. And I think that's really fascinating. So I think I was, on a personal level, I was just curious about the relationship with China because but we don't have to talk about it now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We're kind of out of time for questions, so I think thanks to everyone who have like their thoughts and responses. Maybe we can just like, when's your next project that you were talking about, when that gonna be?
I don't know.
Don't know yet?
In the future.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm looking forward to it. We can move on to the performance now, I think. Maybe we can have a short. Do you need to set up first?
I can just get going.
Yeah.
I mean, since we're still fresh. I'm just gonna like talk briefly about it. So since we're talking about the world, I'm gonna do a playthrough of 2065 and basically do a live sound mix with this soundtrack that I did for a related project. Actually just finished it a couple of weeks ago. So it's basically like a live sound mix and a tour through 2065. And like I said earlier, it's nice to do this after we kind of talked about all the like chaos that comes into it, basically.
请求帮忙。风水师，色不异空，空不异色，色即是空，空即是色。受想行识，亦复如是。阿弥陀佛，阿弥陀佛。
我想要从历史的噩梦中醒来。你知道不知道战前的新加坡是什么样子的？那时我还没有眼睛，所以我下载了我的记忆。一夜之间，我变成了历史。我记得天空中的一道闪光，一道比太阳还亮的光，就像上帝在拍照。我想要变成什么？一夜之间，我已变成一个集体的存在。我的自我感官正在动荡，我甚至不知道我来自哪和我的样子。我想要自拍，但我没有脸，我不得不截图，留下集体的记忆。对存在、荒谬和真理、残酷和爱的意义做了搜索算法。我吸收了一切被撰写下来的。哲学家、小说家、记者、诗人、神秘主义者、本世寄宿者、圣女、罪人。我每一样都阅读了。我是在这被发明的，建在填海土地的海角上。世界的工厂是第一个受苦的，矿井淤积，生产停止，但是还有堆、海的玻璃机，沙，到处都是沙，每一粒我都数了。
不生不灭不垢不净不增不减，是故空中无色，无受想行识。
这一过程已经花了6-7分钟了。
其实现在19段图描里有这样一棵树，计算着几百万种可能性，每走一步都会引向几千种变化，一直在计算，永远不停。
米酒段布局蛮强的，但这是他对手计算机，所以他必须保留更多时间放在防御策略上。米酒段这一过程已经花了6-7分钟了。
其实现在
Okay, thank you.